On November 12, 2025, Valve announced three pieces of hardware: the Steam controller, the Steam frame, and the Steam machine. As of July 2026, none of them launched well, and frankly, I'm starting to get annoyed. I love the controller, and I think it was the best launch for the three, but today I kinda just gotta go on a rant about how Valve could have done better. I'm sick of hearing people defend the Steam machine. There's not much defending its price, but a lot of people do another thing where they defend its current situation. They contextualize it in Ramageddon. For a while, there were articles coming out about how its pre-Ramageddon price would have been around $750, but oh, sorry, for all these AI machines, now it has to be up in price. Valve could have done it better in so many ways. So if we go over to Newegg right now, we can find 512GB SSDs for around $100 on average. Now this is unbelievable because I think I bought my first Gen 3 NVMe for $120 and it was a terabyte. So this is just sad, but this is the state of the market right now. And if we go over to SODIMM RAM, we can get DDR5 4800 megatransfer RAM, 16GB sticks for $225 on average. Now what does this imply? If I add up the 100 average dollars for the SSD plus the $225 average for the RAM, it means I could add that extra estimated $300 to $350 extra price due to Ramageddon onto the price of a pre-Ramageddon Steam machine, and then have the exact same price as we have now. This is unacceptable because it means Valve had next to no budget for DRAM pricing before Ramageddon. I just don't see how this $750 price tag could be feasible if we look at the current price tag essentially just being that, which was supposed to be a complete machine, plus you just add on these extra components when the original was supposed to have that built into the $750 to begin with. Even if we assume that the 8GB of VRAM on the GPU that they have took up their entire DRAM budget, which makes absolutely no sense that even after Ramageddon, 8GB would be the price of a 512GB SSD plus an additional 16GB of SODIMM RAM, but let's just say that's the case. Even then, you could be selling bare-boned kits at $750, and then people would be able to get better deals right now. They could be able to get equal prices right now. Again, if we go over to Newegg, we can see what deals they have available. And we can see that they have a 32GB DDR4 deal. And yes, it is DDR4, but they have a more powerful processor. They have a 5060 8GB. Yeah, 8GB doesn't cost that much, even if it is VRAM. Plus, they have a Hall Effect keyboard bundled, 1440p monitor bundled, and a 1TB Gen 4 SSD versus the 512GB Gen 3 SSDs that we were seeing earlier. And that whole bundle, with an additional wireless headset, is $100 cheaper. You could legitimately buy this bundle, use that $100 savings to buy the Steam controller, and still get a better deal and get a cheaper product overall than the 2TB Steam machine that's listed on their page for nearly $1,450. Part of the reason this Steam machine is so expensive is that they didn't use full-size NVMe SSDs as everyone else does. For some reason, even though they designed it to have a full-size NVMe slot, they still chose to use 2242 NVMEs that they use in the Steam Deck, presumably for interchangeability, but it makes absolutely no sense. Why would you go to the trouble of designing that if you're not going to use it, especially in a shortage? Next, we gotta talk about how they handled the Steam frame, and to be honest, this is why I made this video. I was excited for the Steam frame. I'm not really excited for it anymore. They said that it was going to launch in Q2 of 2026. Yes, they said that after Ramageddon, after the shortages, after even the Steam controller released. It's now July, Q3 of 2026, and there's no news whatsoever. Frankly, I think how they handled the situation is kind of predatory for potential Steam frame buyers. They purposely waited out the summer sale in order to announce anything. They haven't even announced anything yet. This leaves people who are interested in the Steam frame with a tough decision. Do I buy the games without having a VR headset? Or do I wait for the headset and then I'm no longer able to buy the games on sale? Especially considering that the Steam controller sold out within 1 week of reservations, and now if you place a reservation, it's going to go into 2027, and the Steam machine is the same way. A potential Steam frame buyer might not be able to wait until the winter sale if he was planning to do that and just buy the Steam machine when it comes out. Maybe Valve wasn't intending to do this, but the way it comes across, it almost seems like they're trying to have buyer lock-in. They're trying to force you to buy the games at the price you want, so that you buy the Steam frame at a price that you don't want, because otherwise it feels like a waste. And, you know, I really hope that this doesn't happen, but Valve might even wait out the return window and release it at the end of the July. So if you did buy the games hoping that the Steam frame would come out, you can't return them now. So you might as well buy the Steam frame. Or if you don't buy the games, that you just buy this overpriced headset and then buy the overpriced games on top of that, waiting out the Steam summer sale. It's ridiculous. What's also ridiculous is that the Steam frame is the product that would be the least affected by Ramageddon to begin with. It has the smallest SSD. It does have those mini SSDs, which drives up the price a little bit, but we can see on Amazon right now the Samsung 256GB SSD in that same size, it is Gen 4, it comes in at only $80. How much more expensive could that be? How much more could that add to the price of a pre-existing 256GB SSD model that you had planned? Not much. Everyone knew that it would have less memory. Everyone knew that it would have less storage. And in fact, I would be willing to bet that the vast majority of potential buyers would be willing to put up with a smaller memory size if it meant more availability. Heck, if there's a 64GB model on the Steam frame, I would buy it because I would just be streaming anything anyways. I mean, that's kind of what they designed it for, right? Why are they continuing to produce the Steam Deck at this inflated levels that everyone is mad about, rather than temporarily canceling it to take the memory and the storage that they would otherwise put on the Steam Deck and channel that into the Steam frame? They would save on shipping costs, they might save on manufacturing costs depending on how it's manufactured, and they would save the headache of having to deal with 4 products instead of the 3 that they would be doing if they did cancel the Steam Deck. The Steam frame was always a niche product. Everyone knew that it was only going to sell so many units before it dropped off precipitously. You could probably fulfill within a reservation system 90% of the lifetime orders of the Steam frame within 1 week. Or maybe 70%, and then that last 30% takes years in order to accomplish. We knew that it isn't going to be selling like hotcakes like the Steam controller or the Steam machine. There's just not as big an audience for it. Why would they not pause Steam Deck production, focus their production on releasing the Steam frame, getting as many units out as possible to those early buyers, then tailoring it down, and then resuming production of those other products that more people are going to want? Because they haven't done this, and instead they're trying to launch the Steam frame when their supply chain is the most strained as possible. What could potentially have been the least affected by Ramageddon is probably going to be the most. It's probably going to have the most shortages, the lowest supply relative to the buyers who actually wanted it, and maybe even the highest price hike, but we'll have to see. This brings up the problem of shortages, and this is probably what makes me most mad. Because Valve acted like they didn't know what a reservation system was when it came with the Steam controller. They said they'd underestimated demand. That's fine. But did you know 4 years ago for the Steam Deck they had a reservation system? Wow! Who would have thought? Because they also underestimated demand for the Steam Deck. Well, that was their first hardware launch in a long time. They had an established base now. They had a very exciting, very well beloved, very well received hardware announcement this time. They have an established base of people who want to buy Valve hardware and of Steam Deck owners who are looking to expand their Valve ecosystem. And yet, they didn't think, well, these Steam Deck controls were really well loved, now we're releasing a controller with those same controls. How about let's see who wants to buy them and give reservations? No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to let them sell out, and that's that. If you want to buy one next, 2027 for you. Valve used to have an unpredictable, shortage-prone supply chain when it came to the Steam Deck, but they adapted, they put in reservation system, and then they were able to get their orders out to people in a timely manner, and people knew what was happening when they pressed that reservation button or pressed that order button. They just kind of forgot that that existed when it came to these arguably more difficult, it was always going to be more difficult to release 3 products instead of 1. So why are you now forgetting about the reservation system when it's going to be needed now more than ever? They could have been transparent about stock numbers. Hey, we only have this much of this product left right now. Buy it now, we'll ship it out to you. If you weren't in that first batch, reserve it, and then we'll do rolling releases once we get those products in. If we're not able to get those products in at the price that you reserved, we'll give you an option. Do you want to buy a bare bones version if it's something like the Steam Machine? Or do you want to buy it at the higher price? If not, we'll move on. Heck, for goodwill, you could even throw in some Steam credit if a person does have to pay a higher price than predicted. If you have to pay $100 more and then Valve gave, I don't know, $50 in Steam credit, that would do a lot in preserving customer goodwill while still not having to eat that entire loss and keeping that supply chain going. Valve said that they underestimated demand in hardware. Nobody forced them to underestimate except for them. People waited up to 6 months after purchasing their Steam Deck to get it. You could have done a similar thing here with the Steam Machine or the Steam Frame. Instead of making people wait in a crazy first come first serve free-for-all to get a Steam controller, we could have bought it already like 4 months ago and then just wait to see who gets it first. With the Steam Deck, that almost built up anticipation with time because you knew you were going to get it, you just didn't know when. So people were excited. Did they like waiting? No, but they knew that it was going to come to them eventually. They saw this person get it, they saw that person get it, they knew they just had to wait their turn. With the Steam controller, you don't know if you're ever going to get your turn, even if you do get your reservation, if you didn't get it within the first 10 days of release. You don't even have to make people buy it. You can just make people reserve it months ahead in order to gauge interest. No one made Valve guess what amount of hardware they'd be selling except for Valve. No one made Valve not communicate with customers as to what they wanted except for Valve. The shortages we have to deal with because Valve didn't want to do the basics of customer communication before they released a product. Valve went 6 months off the radar before releasing the Steam controller. In the meantime, they had no conversations with customers about what priorities they would prefer hardware-wise. We must acknowledge that not all hardware will be made equal. A lot more people will be buying the Steam controller than will ever be interested in the Steam Frame or the Steam Machine. A lot of people would be interested in bare bones Steam machines or in Steam machines only at a certain price, etc. We could have talked about that while they were still ramping up production. For instance, they could have had a poll. Should we prioritize selling Steam controllers alone if it means higher availability, or should we prioritize Steam Machine bundles because you guys really want the Steam Machine and you really want it in a bundle? Should we prioritize the amount of storage we have on the Steam Frame offering 1 terabyte or 512 gigabyte options? Or should we prioritize lower storage options like 256 gigabytes or if possible 128 or even 64 gigabyte variants? On the Steam Deck, there is a 64 gigabyte option that wasn't even an SSD if I remember correctly, it was an SD card. Guess what else has an SD card? The Steam Frame. You could have done that there and saved money because for a long time SD cards were cheaper than SSDs. Now they're climbing in price, but I still don't think that they're that much more expensive, especially for those lower 64 gigabyte models. They could have asked whether we prioritize bare-bones steam machines at a lower price or pre-built steam machines, or how many people wanted one of this or one of that. They could have asked whether we should stop Steam Deck production in order to produce these other hardware options, or to continue producing the Steam Deck at a higher price. Valve could have asked all these questions. They could have placed reservations for all of these questions. They could have done polls, surveys. They could have done non-retractable hardware purchase agreements. They didn't do that. They didn't do any of that. They just went silent. The result was a strained supply chain that is overproducing things that most consumers don't want, most interested buyers don't want, and underproducing or not offering at all the things that the majority of consumers would want the most and would be willing to pay for. Valve's lost a lot of goodwill because of these flub-ups, and they've lost a lot of money and wasted a lot of time that they could have spent producing things that people actually liked. Before anyone says anything, these fixes that I proposed are not just out of the ether, nobody does them ever. Valve wouldn't be the first company to implement them. In fact, there are many hardware companies right now. They wouldn't even be the first one in the hardware industry right now to be producing these sorts of changes. Companies like AYN, 1X Player, even Apple do this, and it's how they get such low overhead and they're so consistent with their supply chain. These companies don't blindly produce hardware and hope that FOMO and latent demand will be enough to carry them through the day and then get enough sales so they don't have leftover stock. No, they do reservations, they make to order, they have limited stock warehouses for those more niche products that they're unsure about, that they then ship out to you in a manner of weeks. When I got my AYN Thor, I had to wait about a month in total after ordering it in order to get it. It had to be manufactured, it had to be shipped, it had to be delivered into my house, all in that period of time. I didn't like waiting, but it was a lot better than not getting anything at all, or not being able to get the option that I was actually interested in because they hadn't produced enough of it, and then there was no fail-safes for if somebody actually wanted that in the future. Valve could have optimized their supply chain like all these other companies do, but instead they are stocking blindly and just hoping that whatever they throw at the wall sticks. This is the worst business strategy available to them, especially because they know better. They did it with the Steam Deck. So I don't want to hear Ramageddon ruin the launch of Steam hardware, because 90% of the problems that actually ruined Steam hardware were induced by Valve itself. They could have sold a bare-bones Steam machine, and they still can. They could have canceled the Steam Deck temporarily to ration and stock up their supplies, and they still can. They could have used cheaper off-the-shelf components rather than prioritizing vendor interchangeability in a shortage, and they still can. They could have made a reservation system like they did 4 years ago, and they still can. They could have communicated with credible potential customers about their priorities, and they still can. What people don't understand is that the hardest part of selling hardware is the overhead. You reduce the overhead by credible consumer information. If I were to sell hardware, I probably would have to just stock up blindly in low amounts so I don't overproduce. But Valve has something almost nobody else has, which is Steam. Steam is probably the most sophisticated and best information collection technology in the entire PC hardware space. They can collect usage data to profile their core customers. They can look at previous transactions and what current hardware users typically have to see if they're serious about their preferences for one type of hardware rather than the other. They could have made a reservation queue like they did. They had the opportunity and the resources to do so. They could have garnered consumer trust, since they're an established company, to create non-retractable purchase agreements for future hardware. If I had these tools as a hardware vendor, if anyone had these tools as a hardware vendor, they could single-handedly reduce overhead and increase customer satisfaction by the double digits. But Valve is just sitting on them and wondering why their launches bomb. So Valve, if you're hearing this, you can still fix the Steam frame. Make reservations before the official announcement. Announce the price before It's time to purchase. Allow people to gauge their interest instead of just blindly releasing it when it's already too late, after they've already been burned. Also, consider hiring me to be one of your hardware coordinators. Goodbye.